it resulted in the distortion of international law.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank all of you for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for participating. The way I'd like to tackle the question, Andrew, with your permission, is to lead off from your introduction. You see, immediately after the establishment of the State of Israel, all of our neighbors decided that they have to get rid of us, and the way to get rid of us was through the use of force. And so from 1948 until 1973, primarily, all the attempts to resolve this situation were by killing. However, conflicts are usually fought on four different arenas. You have the military conflict, you have a political arena, you have a public opinion arena, and you have an economic arena. And all of our neighbors and enemies decided that the military arena was the one they should go for. I also remind you that they launched the Arab boycott in 1945, and the intention was to harm us on the economic stage as well. Now, an important development after the Yom Kippur War was that they realized that apparently they won't be able to succeed on the military level, and that in spite of the best effort, the economic attempt to strangle the relatively new Israeli country was failing because Israel was growing. And so we saw a gradual shift in the politics by shifting to a political movement combined with terrorism. And the terrorism, now, one of the things I ask my students, for example, in university, what is the goal of terrorism in general? And the goal of terrorism in general is not usually just to kill one or two individuals. It's to achieve political, ideological, or religious goals. In this case, the purpose of Palestinian terrorism was to create a new dynamic which would force Israel to change its positions with respect to the resolution of the conflict. And I have to say, sadly, that they succeeded, because the first intifada from 1987 to 1993 brought about the Oslo process. And there's no doubt about it that if it were not for the Palestinian terrorism, there would not have been an Oslo peace process. And I was, for 20 years, a member of the Israeli peace negotiating team, which started in 91 with the Madrid conference and in 93 with the Oslo process. So what we saw was that terrorism was used as a methodology to try and force Israel to change its positions. However, the next shift occurred around 2000. I will remind everyone that in 2000, there were two important events. The first was the failed peace summit at Camp David, hosted by President Clinton. I participated in that summit and we failed. But there was also another important event. 2001 was the UN Special Conference on Racial Discrimination. And one of the four formative events for that was the Durban Conference in 2000. And the Durban Conference in the year 2000, under the auspices of the United Nations, was where all of our enemies, all the pro-Palestinian groups, came together and said, okay, we can't beat the Israelis through the use of force. They're not susceptible to political violence as much as we thought they were. Even economically, we're not doing well. So we have to focus on number 4, public opinion. And the idea which arose ironically in Durban was that we need to create a process whereby Israel will go down the same delegitimization process which white South Africa went through in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And thus was born the entire strategy of delegitimizing Israel. And they launched this in a 3-pronged attack. One was public opinion, and the issue which Josh will talk about in a minute, equating Israel and apartheid, is one component out of a multitude of components of public opinion delegitimization. The second was to launch a legal campaign where hopefully Israel or Israelis would be found guilty of violations of war crimes, crimes against humanity again. But the purpose was not the specific case, but just like terrorism, the purpose was to delegitimize Israel through these processes. And the ICC is just the last in a long chain of attempts to create this legal delegitimization. But the third was to use the terrorism, which has been with us now for 50 plus years, as another mechanism to create negative public opinion against Israel. And they've been incredibly good at doing so. And I will give a few examples. So for example, when they fire rockets at Israel and we fire back, one of the things they come up with is a comparison of number of casualties. Now, of course, we have Iron Dome, so we have relatively few casualties. So they generate the discussion, and the allies generate the discussion. Israel must be doing something wrong. There are 100 dead Palestinians and only 3 dead Israelis. The Israelis must be at fault. So they're creating a dynamic where suddenly, because we defend ourselves, we are apparently the bad guys. We even found in one of the operations in Gaza, Andrew, we found a Hamas handbook, which said, place military items within civilian locations. And it says something very interesting. I was told this by my friends in the army when they found it. And it said, either they won't attack because they're not allowed to attack civilian locations because of the laws of war, or they will attack and they will cause civilian casualties and will use those to explain that they're committing war crimes. So we can't lose. So what they have identified is that in the David and Goliath situation where we face Palestinian terrorism, and that's true of Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah, which is a slightly different agenda in the north, etc., is that no matter what we do, there's a way to try and take that story and present it as Israel doing something in violation of international law. And that joins in the chorus of the alleged delegitimization actions by Israel. And that is part of this process. So in effect, what you can see when you look backwards is that the Palestinians who are not pro-peace, and there are groups who are pro-peace, but those people are not pro-peace, and the funders and proponents like Iran use terrorism as a catalyst for violence. That's one agenda. But the second, as a catalyst for incidents which can be claimed against Israel as unlawful, unethical, immoral activities. So when one of my students comes up to me and says, how can you justify that the people of Gaza are stuck in Gaza and can't leave? So I say to him, well, there are 2 different answers to that question. Answer number 1, this is a specific case in point. One is, I'd rather they stop shooting at me so that we can start treating them like human beings. And 2, you do remember that Gaza has 2 international borders, right? They have one with Israel and one with Egypt. Are you asking the Egyptians the same question, or is the question only focused against us? Now, he said, oh, I didn't realize that they have a border with Egypt. And this is a smart student. Palestinians have been extraordinarily successful in transforming any story as everything about us. No one else is involved, no one else is at fault, etc. So if I will summarize my answer to your question, Palestinians understand the potential power of international law because international law is generally accepted among the Western countries as the standard metric of legal and normative behavior. And therefore, if they can create an international dialogue whereby normal people think that Israel is doing illegitimate things, it will increase the delegitimization spiral of Israel, and their goal to reach a certain level of delegitimization, which will force the international community to impose international sanctions on Israel, just like South Africa suffered. And that should create a positive result, something of that nature. So that's a long-winded answer to a relatively short question, Andrew.
So, Daniel, how is this kind of playing out today? For example, in the International Criminal Court, you know, I see it also with sitting here from a European perspective, the European Union pays lip service to Palestinian terror. So they always mention Israel's right to defend itself. They mention, that the PLO should stop using terror and all the rest of it. But at the same time, they're trying to enforce a territorial solution to a conflict without taking regard to Israel's security needs. And it seems to me it's almost like the campaign of terror and violence has created a kind of a culture whereby the international community thinks it needs to impose a settlement on Israel and this conflict. Would you agree with that?
I don't think that's where the international community is. I think, I'll tell you where they're not. I think that the international community has lost both the belief and in many respects also the interest in helping resolve a negotiated solution. Now, there are lots of reasons why this happened. A, because we tried for 20 years and failed. B, because Europe has its own problems. So the energy level required to support such a process here is extraordinarily high. It needs both political and media and monetary support, all of which are currently off the move. So I don't think anyone realistically believes that there is currently a possibility for re-energizing a meaningful relationship. The problem is that the conflict hasn't gone away. And everyone is only interested in stop bothering us. Why can't you make peace somehow? That's how they treat us today. And they almost don't care about why we're fighting, because it's like the children in the other room. Stop making noise. They don't care about who's right, who's wrong. They care about the fact that we're making noise. And what we're noticing is that this level of being tired results in, why can't we come up with simple solutions? Now, one such potential simple solution would be, we'll tell you what the result is and just do what we tell you, which is how you treat children. Unfortunately, I don't think that's, well, fortunately and unfortunately, I don't think that's viable or on the books either. So the reality is, I think what we're seeing is, on the one hand, the Israeli-Palestinian dispute has lost its, what I would say, top 10 listing. It used to be the most important dispute in the world. I don't think it's on the top 50 now in any country. I used to go all over the world and I would hear questions about West Bank, Gaza, etc. Newspapers, just look at CNN or BBC and see how many articles there are, or news video programs about our conflict. Maybe once a week, a very short mention. The world has lost interest in this dispute. One of the goals, by the way, of Palestinian terrorism is to try to regenerate interest. So in my opinion, we've lost energy. Now, I personally, as a survivor of the peace negotiations, am very sad about the fact that we've lost energy. But one of the potential side consequences of losing energy is that people may come up with saying, okay, children, this is what you're going to do, and we don't care about the fact. And that is something we have to be very careful about, because I do not believe such solutions will necessarily be either reasonable or fair, if and when they're put on the table.
One of the things, so in a way, what you're saying is there's less interest in the conflict. Israel is managing the conflict, I suppose, in its own way. How dangerous do you find the concept of Palestinian statehood, and particularly the insistence on the PLO? Really, it's still the PLO and the PA which will form the basis of a Palestinian state, and the PLO has never abandoned its advocacy of the use of terror and violence to achieve its goals, which is the liberation of Palestine. How dangerous is that? How much of a threat is that? Or is it, from Israel's perspective, just another issue to manage?
Up to 10 years ago, the two-state solution was the only item on the menu. And the two-state solution, which is what I helped negotiate for 20 years for the government, comes with a lot of problems and dangers. I think the most important of them is you can sign an agreement with whoever you want, but the reality is that these territories are unstable, and you could easily find yourself with a country controlled by a fundamentalist Islamic movement such as Hamas in 15 seconds with the capabilities of a full state. So put that on the table, look at Gaza, multiply it by 3 or 4, and suddenly you have it, 12 kilometers from Tel Aviv, you have a Muslim fundamentalist state. That is a real risk, okay? Having said that, you asked for my personal opinion. I have to tell you that I have yet to hear anyone come up with a solution which is better. You see, the real problem for me is the following. The current situation is not sustainable for long. Something will break. The Palestinian Authority will be taken over by Hamas. Something will happen, and I am willing to put money that whatever will happen will not be good for Israel, because change in this context, in this region, usually does not bring lots of opportunity. We are using the time wisely now to create new alliances with the Gulf states, with Morocco, with Jordan, etc., to protect ourselves against such instability. But the reality is that our relationship with the Palestinians is currently in an unstable status quo, if I can use such a weird term. So the other end of the equation, which is a one-state type solution, for me is catastrophe for us. I don't care about the Palestinians, but the Jewish character of the state of Israel will not survive if you combine all of the residents between Israel, the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. We lose the majority of Jews in that territory, and that is not what I bought into when we talked about the Jewish state of Israel. So I'm still stuck with the fact that we need some type of political separation-related arrangement. Having said that, I am fully aware, and I totally agree with you, Andrew, that such an arrangement is fraught with dangers which have to be addressed. It's just that I haven't found anyone with a better idea.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. Well, we'll come back to you on that. We're going to move on to